At some point on the 4th of September, 2022, inside a house in San Diego, a GPS ankle monitor stopped doing the one thing it was supposed to do. It was no longer tracking Leonard Glenn Francis. The man at the center of one of the largest corruption scandals in U.S. Navy history was under house arrest, waiting for sentencing. The government already had him. The case had been exposed. The plea had been entered. The story was supposed to be moving toward its final chapter. But then the signal broke. The ankle monitor had been cut. Neighbors had reportedly seen moving trucks around the property days before. By the time authorities understood what had happened, Francis was already gone. Not from the room, not from the neighborhood, from the country, and somehow, the US government had lost the same man it had spent years trying to catch. But the real question wasn't how he escaped the house. It was how he had walked through the Navy for more than a decade before anyone stopped him. Leonard Glenn Francis was not a soldier. He was not an admiral. He did not command a fleet, wear a uniform, or sit inside the official chain of command. He was a defense contractor. His company, Glenn Defense Marine Asia, provided husbanding services to U.S. Navy ships across the Pacific. That sounds ordinary, almost forgettable. But husbanding is what happens when a warship stops moving. Fuel, water, tugboats, food, waste removal, port security, transport, paperwork. The quiet machinery behind naval power. And Francis learned how to control it. According to federal prosecutors and his own guilty plea, he bribed Navy officers and officials with cash, luxury hotels, fine dining, travel, gifts, and sex workers. In exchange, he received classified and sensitive ship schedules, inside contracting information, and influence over where Navy vessels docked. Then he billed the government. Again and again. By his own admission, he overcharged the U.S. Navy by $35 million. This is the story of how a private businessman bought access to the movement of a superpower. The 7th Fleet was not just another naval command. It was the forward edge of American sea power in the Indo-Pacific, operating across a vast stretch of ocean where military presence is measured not only in ships, but in timing, distance, fuel, ports, and access. Destroyers, command ships, submarines, aircraft carriers. On paper, these vessels represent force, but even the most advanced warship becomes dependent the moment it enters a foreign port. It needs tugboats to guide it in. It needs fuel to keep moving. It needs fresh water, waste removal, pier security, buses, food supplies, local permits, hotel arrangements, and dockside coordination. That is where the system becomes vulnerable. Because logistics is not background administration. In the 7th Fleet, logistics was the bloodstream. A ship could project power across an ocean, but when it entered port, it still needed contracts, invoices, local vendors, dock workers, barges, fuel lines, and someone to make all of it happen. That someone was often a husbanding contractor. And in many Pacific ports, Leonard Glenn Francis had spent years making himself difficult to avoid. He did not attack the Navy from the outside. He positioned himself beside the exact point where the Navy had to slow down, dock, refuel, resupply, and trust somebody else. That was the target, not the ships themselves. The dependency around them. Leonard Glenn Francis understood something simple. The Navy did not just run on command. It ran on arrangements. Hotel rooms, port permits, fuel deliveries, tugboat schedules, security barriers. Invoices approved under pressure. Francis was a Malaysian businessman and the head of Glenn Defense Marine Asia, known as GDMA. The company provided husbanding services to U.S. Navy ships operating across Asian ports. In practical terms, GDMA became the local fixer for some of the most powerful vessels in the world. When a ship arrived, somebody had to organize the port call. Somebody had to coordinate vendors. Somebody had to make sure the services appeared when the ship needed them. And Francis built his power inside that gap. Not with one meeting. Not with one contract. Over years, he learned the people, the ports, the routines, the habits, and the pressure points. He built relationships not just with offices, but with officers. He watched how decisions moved. He understood who mattered before they became important. And slowly, the contractor became something more dangerous than a vendor. He became familiar, trusted, useful. Francis did not need to own a warship. He only needed to own the moment when that warship needed help. The luxury came first. Expensive dinners in private rooms, luxury hotels in Asian port cities, paid travel, gifts, cash, entertainment that did not appear on official schedules. Sex workers arranged during port visits. From the outside, it could look like excess, a contractor showing off, officers enjoying privileges they should have refused. But the luxury had a function. It created loyalty. It created silence. And, eventually, it created access. Francis was not spending money for atmosphere. He was buying information. Some officers gave him ship schedules before they were publicly available. Others passed sensitive movement details, contracting information, competitor pricing, or internal warnings about investigations. In some cases, the people meant to protect the system helped him understand how to avoid it. That changed everything. Because once Francis knew where a ship was going, when it would arrive, what services it needed, and who could approve the bill, he was no longer reacting to Navy movement. He was preparing for it. And, in some cases, helping shape it. A port visit could become an opportunity. A schedule could become a commercial advantage. A classified or sensitive document could become profit. What Francis bought was not friendship. He bought timing, location, silence, and paperwork. That was the trade. The Navy gave him access. He gave them luxury. Then he sent the bill to the U.S. government. The system worked because it looked ordinary. A U.S. Navy ship entered port. It needed support. Tugboats to guide it in. Fresh water, fuel, waste removal, security, transport, food, local coordination, documents signed before the vessel could leave again. GDMA arranged those services. That was the official version. But if Leonard Glenn Francis knew the schedule before others did, he could prepare before anyone else entered the room. If he knew which ship was coming, when it would arrive, how long it would stay, and what it would need, he had an advantage before the port call even began. And if officers helped steer that ship toward a port where GDMA already had control, the advantage became something else. It became a machine. Once the vessel docked, the billing environment belonged to him. The Navy was operating in foreign ports, under time pressure, depending on local vendors, and often relying on paperwork created or controlled by the same contractor arranging the service. That meant a tugboat could become more than a tugboat. A water delivery could become a number on an invoice. Sewage disposal could be inflated. Security charges could rise. Fuel, transport, port services, and support equipment could all be priced through a system where the people meant to verify the bill were often far away, overworked, or compromised. In some cases, competitive bidding could be manipulated. The appearance of choice remained, but the outcome had already been shaped. And this is what made it powerful. Francis did not need to steal from a vault. He needed the Navy to approve documents. A ship would arrive. GDMA would service it. An officer would sign. The vessel would leave. Then the invoice would move through the system, long after the physical evidence of the port call had disappeared. The invoice was the crime scene, but by the time anyone read it, the ship was already gone. There were warnings. That is what makes the story harder to dismiss as one man's deception. Concerns about GDMA did not appear from nowhere in 2013. Complaints and questions had surfaced before: overcharging, unusual billing. The kind of details that, in a healthy system, should have triggered deeper attention. But attention is not the same as action. Some concerns were reviewed. Some files were closed. Some questions went nowhere. And while the Navy's internal systems moved slowly, Francis had something more valuable than patience. He had people inside. One of the most damaging was John Beliveau, an NCIS special agent. NCIS was supposed to investigate crimes connected to the Navy. It was supposed to be part of the wall between corruption and the institution. But Beliveau leaked investigative information to Francis. That meant Francis could learn what investigators knew. He could learn where they were looking. He could learn which witnesses mattered. The man under scrutiny was being handed pieces of the scrutiny itself. At that point, the weakness was no longer just in contracting. It was in enforcement. Because when the watchdog leaks to the suspect, the system is no longer investigating corruption. It is protecting it. And that protection gave Francis time. Time to keep billing. Time to keep cultivating officers. Time to keep moving through a system that should have stopped him years earlier. In September 2013, the system finally turned around. Federal authorities lured Leonard Glenn Francis to San Diego under the cover of a meeting. This time, he was not arriving as the powerful contractor who knew the ports, the officers, the schedules, and the pressure points. He was arriving into a trap. Francis was arrested. So were others connected to the network. And once the case became public, the scale began to widen. This was no longer a quiet dispute about invoices. It was a federal corruption scandal involving Navy officers, contracting officials, sensitive information, and millions of dollars in admitted overbilling. In 2015, Francis pleaded guilty. He admitted that GDMA had overcharged the U.S. Navy by $35 million. Multiple Navy personnel and officials would eventually plead guilty in connection with the scandal. For a moment, it looked like the machine had finally stopped. But the arrest did not close the story. It opened the archive. Because once Francis started talking, the case stopped being about one contractor. It became a map of everyone who had opened the door for him. Then came September 2022. 9 years after his arrest, Leonard Glenn Francis was still waiting for sentencing. He was not in a federal prison. He was under house arrest in San Diego. And somehow, the man who had compromised parts of the Navy's Pacific network was now being watched from a private residence. Then the ankle monitor was cut. The signal stopped. The house was checked. Francis was gone. He had escaped the United States, moving through Mexico and Cuba before reaching Venezuela. The story that had already embarrassed the Navy now embarrassed the justice system too. An international manhunt followed. Authorities eventually captured him in Venezuela while he was trying to travel onward. But even then, the case became tangled in geopolitics. Francis remained outside U.S. custody until December 2023, when he was returned through a prisoner exchange involving Venezuela. The same man who had slipped through the Navy's oversight for years had now slipped through federal custody in a single morning. First, the Navy failed to control him. Then, after catching him, the government failed to hold him. In November 2024, Leonard Glenn Francis was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was ordered to pay restitution. He was ordered to forfeit millions. Legally, his case had reached an ending. But the system around him did not end cleanly. Many people were charged. Many pleaded guilty. Some went to prison. But the legal aftermath became messy, uneven, and difficult to summarize. In one of the most damaging turns, felony convictions connected to the 7th Fleet trial were vacated after findings of prosecutorial misconduct. A case built to expose corruption had itself become stained by institutional failure. Some senior figures avoided criminal punishment. Others faced administrative consequences instead of public trials. And that leaves the story in a strange place. Francis admitted to overbilling the Navy by $35 million. But was the full financial damage ever truly known? Ship movements and sensitive information were compromised. But was the full national security damage ever publicly understood? Dozens of careers were investigated. But did the Navy punish the system, or mostly the individuals it could prove cases against? And can a military machine this large ever fully control the private contractors it depends on? Because Leonard Glenn Francis did not break into the U.S. Navy. He waited at the port, sent the bill, and watched the system approve it. Subscribe to Silent Archive TV so you don't miss the next case we uncover.